such a good cars, though. They really are, I think.
I mean, he's good.
Are you comfortable? I don't want to be nervous about you falling off the edge. Thank you. Well, Shezad, it's lovely to see you. It's been about 20 years since we first met. And I was leading the arts programme for a borough in London called Tower Hamlets, where I believe you still live. And what did you come to see me about?
Well, I came to see you about an idea I had for a public project to kind of map the space of the borough and all its changing minorities and movements and migrations. And I think I was just a young whippersnapper, barely out of college, and Shreela was kind enough to give me the time of day when very few people would.
Well, what I would say is that, you know, I obviously know how to back a winner. I was terrified when I got here this morning because I couldn't actually remember whether I gave Shezad a grant or not, but given the warm hug that he gave me, I expect I did, but I can't actually remember whether any money passed.
Well, the project happened.
The project happened, yeah.
So, and, you know, yeah, I mean, it's 20 years ago. It seems hard to believe, really. I mean, it's been, I don't know, this weekend's been quite emotional. I was telling Shreela before, I mean, that we were sort of speaking today after 20 years, but also last night, Neil from the Genogly Gallery came for the opening, and he gave me my first ever solo show anywhere in the world here in Nottingham 18 years ago. So it's been a real trip down memory lane, and, you know, one of my other, you know, kind of key solo shows was actually given to me by that man there in the glasses, Kwong Lee, you know, who's very kindly come from Manchester. It's so nice of you to make the trip. I'm really sort of touched. It's been quite an emotional opening, actually. So forgive me if I get a bit kind of excited. But, you know, it just feels like it's been such a sort of trip down really key moments in my life that's led to somehow this moment. So anyway, I'll stop and Shreela take over.
Okay. So when I heard the term encroachments, which, let's face it, we don't hear in everyday parlance here, do we? I reached for my Oxford English Dictionary, and this is what it said. Encroachment, intrusion on a person's territory or rights, or a gradual advance beyond usual or acceptable limits. So is that how these buildings occur? Because they happen, don't they?
They happen.
They're not planned.
They're not planned at all, and they usually happen or start, under cover of night, and they go up very quickly to prevent them being stopped or sort of torn down partway through, because once they're up and functioning, it's much harder to kind of, then it has to go through various processes to get court orders to kind of demolish them, etc. So, I mean, I've seen whole streets go up in less than a week, so, which is impressive. It's really, if we could do that in the construction trade here,
It is impressive, but then when you think about the fact that, in 1951, the population of Karachi was about 1 million, just over, and now it's 20 million?
It's about 22 now.
That would be the official, and then, there are all the...
It's also because the city's grown, so there's a lot of kind of, industrial areas and extension zones that are kind of on the grey area of being incorporated into the city, so it is anywhere between 20 and 24 million. But I remember when I was a kid in Karachi in the late 70s, early 80s, London was the big city. Karachi was still considered kind of small, and it's amazing how it's, in my lifetime, it's totally overtaken.
Yeah. And before I ever went to Karachi, and of course as a Brit, but someone born in India, I never actually thought that I would. And I was hugely excited. I read a couple of books by Kamila Shamsi, a writer who I hope some of you will know, and if you don't, you should go and look it up. But The City by the Sea and Cartography, two of my favorite books, I'd say. I mean, that's, for me, the sort of landscape of Karachi was based on those novels.
Yeah, and I think Karachi is just such a sort of shifting, it's a city, as she calls it in the novel, City by the Sea, but it's had so many successive waves. I mean, it was a fishing city, really, and it became a port, and it became a big sort of migrant zone within South Asia, after partition. I mean, it's a city of immigrants.
Yeah.
And that's not so well known outside of Pakistan.
Yeah. That swelling of the city's population was as a result of the Muslims from India, well, now India, moving across the border in 1947.
And, Karachi, as a sort of, at the time, undeveloped fishing port, was a place they could go to and kind of make their own, because a lot of those were sort of displaced persons. And, other areas of what is now Pakistan had very set communities, hierarchies, and it was much harder for these new immigrants to get a kind of foothold.
Yeah. And those tensions between the Sindhi population and the newcomers, there's a word for them. What
Mahajir.
is it? Mahajir. That sort of runs through Pakistani politics, in contemporary politics, doesn't it?
I mean, it's interesting because in Pakistan I'm a Mahajir and here I'm an immigrant, so it's this kind of, where do I fit? And possibly nowhere. And there's that sort of, it's an interesting thing in terms of, Theresa May's hostile environment that, calling people citizens of nowhere, and it was like, well, you're talking to me, honey, but you're not getting my vote.
Okay, so back to the exhibition then. So these encroachments that fascinated you, that was the start of the idea?
It was kind of, for a number of years, as the project started cooking, I was returning to Karachi, and Encroachments was just in sort of internally in the country and on telly, in the newspapers, was a really big deal. And, and even people I would speak to were sort of like, yes, this is terrible and this should be stopped, and it's, and maybe it was the sort of teenage Marxist in me, but I was kind of like, I kind of like it. I had a sort of more left-wing and left-field view of these spaces, but also what was interesting is they didn't conform to maybe my left-wing politics, because actually the people, as I spent time in Encroachments and talked to people, they were seeing themselves totally as entrepreneurs, as social entrepreneurs as well, because these spaces were not just about making money, but creating community. So, when a whole street goes up, it's often a mixed set of shops, sometimes with even flats above. but particularly, and for those who've done the VR or might do, there's a Contemporary Encroachments is the last scene, but it's a tea shop where I spent. It just became my encroachment of choice because it's in a place called Landi, which wasn't considered part of Karachi when I was a kid, but now very much is this sort of industrial zone, sort of extension of Karachi. So that idea that it's already a grey area or sort of liminal territory, and then the tea house and is part of a whole sort of encroachment kind of block, and it becomes a real focal point for the community. So interestingly, it's kind of an encroachment, an intrusion onto privately owned land, which is owned by, disputedly, between two of the big factory owners there. But interestingly, the tea shop itself, all the low-paid factory workers come there. So it's, in a way, that even the factory owners are kind of, they hate it, but they're sort of loath to close it down because it provides a sort of provision for their workers that they're not doing. So it's this interesting, range of kind of things going on that sort of defies, maybe a traditional idea of a sort of left-wing politics, of beneficial ownership, the commons. It's sort of all mixed in, but it's its own dynamic. It's not a sort of simple dynamic. Although actually, I suppose with the whole increased focus, I don't know if people have been reading about, private space masquerading as public in the UK increasingly as councils do deals with developers and large corporates. There's a lot of places where you can get, which appear to be public space and were once public space but have been sold off. So if you start loitering or looking like you haven't got money to spend, you will be moved along. And so it's interesting, actually, having done all the work in Karachi on it, I'm seeing that a similar logic sort of start to translate here.
Yeah, so kind of pop-up, box park, pop-up, those kind of things.
Well, here, we're not fighting back in the same way.
Yeah.
I think it's more, it's more rigid. The rules are more rigid and rigidly enforced, and that sort of assumption of public space is actually being stolen behind our backs.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, if you look at the King's Cross development, for example, there aren't any streets anymore. It's owned by Google or someone. But, I wanted to talk about that because I think here, any of those things that are so-called pop-ups are still kind of co-opted.
Like Box Park that you're mentioning.
Yeah, exactly.
Do people know Box Park?
There's one in Brixton and one in Shoreditch.
And they're in other parts of the country now as well. It's a model using kind of shipping containers to become a sort of hip shopping, eating zone that looks like it's grassroots, but it's absolutely not. It's corporately engineered, and they place sort of brands in them, and it's all sort of deals are signed up before they ever go on site.
So to that extent, the kind of encroachment culture, the basti as I know it in India, for example, is a much more political gesture.
It is. I mean, even in sort of Bombay, I've seen people actually steal the sort of large plastic pipes from kind of construction sites and actually literally tie them to the sort of underside of flyovers as sort of makeshift dwellings. So, it's bonkers. I don't know about the health and safety, but there's a creative reclamation of space, but that, I can't help but sort of celebrate in terms of an idea of the commons and what it, which seems to be disappearing before our very eyes. So I guess by now I've given away totally where my sympathies lie. Whereas I wanted with the project to kind of extend it as well from the sort of actual encroachments to this, the definition's a good way in, because if you talk about intrusions and territory, I started to make a parallel between the sort of negative reaction in Pakistani media to encroachments and, of course, the equally negative reaction to unannounced US drone strikes. And, there was the same mouthpieces in politics and the media were sort of decrying US drone strikes as a sort of intrusion onto sovereignty and territory, and that were kind of decrying the encroachments. And it was like, oh, well, you know, I'm kind of in support of the encroachments, but I also think this sort of idea of, you know, how do you ever create right relations between countries if you totally overrun their sovereignty on a regular basis?
You're jumping ahead a bit, because I wanted
Sorry.
to... we are going to talk about US-Pakistan relations, but I want to start at, well, I don't know if it's the very beginning, but certainly, as I see it, the kind of post-war dynamic is one of Britain withdrawing back, the end of empire, and America moving into that space. So you've got some interesting things to say about Cold War and soft power through the arts and architecture. So how does that kind of play into it? Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because this project, you know, fits into a whole kind of series of projects I've been doing, looking at the kind of modern period in South Asia and what it says about, you know, I guess almost maybe lost utopias in terms of the non-aligned movement, in terms of, you know, I suppose more progressive moments in internal politics that were disrupted for particular kind of agendas. And of course, you know, I remember being at art school and there was this sort of, what was then very much thought of as a conspiracy theory about the CIA bankrolling abstract expressionism, which we now know through released documents was absolutely true. And that, you know, the CIA, I mean, I've seen documents where it's, you know, the CIA picked Jackson Pollock because they thought Franz Klein was too Jewish, de Kooning was too European sounding, you know, Gorky too Russian, could be a commie, you know, and, you know, Pollock was the most waspy, and that's why they chose him. And interestingly, while the CIA were doing that with the arts, and also the documents reveal that it was very much about stealing a jump on Europe, and particularly on Paris as the capital of culture pre-war. So it was like, how do we position New York as the kind of center of, and it's interesting that they thought that modern art was the key driver. I don't know if they care so much about it these days, the CIA.
And it was really interesting that it was not popular at home.
It was totally,
yeah.
nobody liked it.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you had all the headlines of Jack the Dripper. So it was this sort of very interesting idea of these very sort of highly educated CIA operatives championing, you know, Jack the Dripper, who was dreadfully unpopular with the American people. And so, I shouldn't laugh so much, but I love these kind of total ships in the night, kind of failures of narratives to kind of actually make sense of each other. But interestingly, and maybe less known than the CIA and abstract expressionism, in the early 50s, the US State Department launched a very similar parallel program called the Embassy Building Program, which was trying to send modern architects to newly independent, newly created third world countries as a buffer against Soviet communism, and again to steal a jump on European culture. And you know, the most famous of these is the embassy in Saigon, because actually it was the last point of embarkation for the last US troops as they were evacuated from its rooftop in the famous kind of Associated Press photos. But they were doing it, you know, all through the third world. And, you know, Richard Neutra, the sort of great Viennese California modernist, was sent to Pakistan to build the new US embassy in Karachi. And I'll come back to that in a second, but very much they were trying to sell an idea of openness. So they wanted modernism both to give an idea of the future, of vectors of speed, of power, but also open vistas to show that America was this open, you know, melting pot to give it. And it was actually, you know, to be fair, it wasn't all bad. They were trying to sell something actually relatively kind of utopian, very briefly, but and it actually failed for a number of reasons, not least the Vietnam War, but even before that, in '62, you had in Argentina, at the new modernist US embassy there, you had student protests And the State Department was so shocked by this, 62 became this pivotal shift in the guidelines for embassies. And so embassies went from being symbols of openness to defensive fortresses. And it marks this almost shift in US foreign policy, which becomes far more aggressive, far more manipulative, far more targeted. So it's this interesting moment where the sort of brief possibility of America attempting to be a positive force in the world, you know, it's the propaganda of that continues, but the actual action becomes much more radical. You know, by then they've already displaced Mossadegh in Iran, who was the sort of democratically elected sort of socialist leader, and they institute the Shah, and we all know where that ends up. We're still living it. And that's what I'm really interested in, that all of these legacies are totally our present. They're not the past. They so inform our present, and unless we sort of unpick them, we don't, the news is all bollocks unless we unpick these stories. Everything we read is a call of mirrors.
I don't know if the news is bollocks, but it's certainly depressing. Yeah, I mean, you can see images of this amazing, what must have been like a kind of behemoth, that building, right, to the scale of the rest of Karachi when it was built.
Yes, when it was built.
From the aerial photographs that.
Yeah, from the aerial photographs, that road, which is now a main thoroughfare and it's totally built up, you know, it was quite a structure.
But you know that building well, don't you?
I mean, interestingly,
you went there.
I mean, other projects I've done, exploring this include like Corbusier in Chandigarh and the Raymonds in Pondicherry, and I've obviously visited those places and done my research, but this one, you know, it's for people who've seen the exhibition, there's a sculpture which is called the American Center. It's this sort of brightly colored section of Neutra's embassy. And it's literally this section of it that was called the American Center, which functioned a bit like the British Council, a bit more propagandistic.
It's okay, I don't work for them anymore.
Okay, I can say what I like. But the American Center would seduce Pakistani youth with comic books and really unhealthy food snacks. And for a kid growing up in Karachi, where culture was very limited, this just seemed, I was, for all my now sort of academic critiques as a kid, I mean, it was like you could get comic books and Hostess Twinkies. It seemed like the promised land, and you really believed the narrative. You were like, you wanted everything American, like many people behind the Iron Curtain, who were so desperate for blue jeans. But weirdly now you've got sort of, in Moscow, you've got Soviet-era themed restaurants and cafes because people are getting nostalgic for it. So it's...
Yeah. So born in 1962 in India, the modernist style that Shezad's describing, well, I didn't, obviously as a child, I didn't know what modernist was. That would have been terribly precocious. But I just thought that's what buildings look like. It was many, many years afterwards that I looked through these books and I thought, oh, I know these buildings. I didn't know they were iconic. And one of the loveliest buildings, well, actually, during my career with the British Council, I worked in two amazing buildings. The first one in Dhaka, a modernist building. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the architect, but it is iconic. The library in Dhaka was famous because so many romances started there. So the generation of people who are now in their 50s and 60s all used to come to events at the British Council when I was there because they literally met their husband, their partner there. And, it was where people could go legitimately saying they're going to the library was fine to their families, and that's where they would go. And the other building that I worked is the last building that the British Council ever commissioned, actually, and probably spent money on, is Charles Corrier's building in Delhi, which is one of the most beautiful buildings, I think, in the world. Yeah. You know it, don't you?
I mean, also a lot of these buildings are very beautiful, and, I don't think, it was only later I really sort of started to understand all the different angles of the Neutra building. and I was really lucky through the process of this project. I even ended up talking to Richard Neutra's son, one of his two surviving sons, who actually worked with his father late on and before his death, and kind of took over the practice from him. And a lot of the way I kind of work is kind of like, it's sort of research bordering on sort of detective work, and I mean it's one of the most fun parts of what I do. And there were so many stories around not just the Neutra building, but its prehistory. So even dating from the British Raj, there was a Victorian writer who wrote a ghost story about that plot of land. So apparently a Sufi fakir or holy man was buried on that site, and he put a curse on anyone who would build over his shrine. And interestingly, in the Victorian period, supposedly, and I've never been able to fully establish whether this Victorian era story is based on actual events, but it talks about a Parsi gentleman who he and his family build a house on that site, and they all die terrible deaths. Great period film in there somewhere. And then interestingly, there's a later sort of ghost story written in the I think in the 70s by a Pakistani author about when it is a US governmental building, about ghosts haunting it, and the various US clerical staff being kind of terrified by photocopiers turning on by themselves and weird things going on, after dark.
When it was the CIA, of course, turning on the photocopiers.
Just to keep the staff on their toes. But interestingly, and I, as an adult, basically they, I think it was in 2015, the US State Department sold the building to Pakistani developers who've been trying to knock it down ever since. But there's been a big campaign to preserve it, and it just made it really hard to get into the building, because I really wanted to get back in there as an adult and film it and sort of do my exploration. And it took me years of trying, and I finally got in there, and I'd filmed all around, and what was amazing was the guy who took me around the building was this really beautiful old man, really skinny as a rake, really tall, with a big white beard, and he'd been the caretaker for 20 years. And it was just amazing, because he showed me, one of the things I'd read in some redacted documents was about the CIA supercomputer that existed. It's a bit like the Harry Potter platform at King's Cross Station. There was half a floor that didn't exist in the building. And I went into and it was this amazing, like, being John Malkovich moment where you're sort of stepping into space that doesn't exist. And you're like, will I cease to exist? It's just, And I love those sort of conceptual, philosophical kind of ways of kind of tripping through space. And he showed me in the terrazzo flooring the kind of holes in the floor where the CIA had ripped out the supercomputer. And this supercomputer took up like a corridor longer than this room. Probably, less powerful than any of our phones, but it was secret because they fitted that as a response to the Soviet invasion of neighboring Afghanistan. So it was a secret CIA sort of listening and receiving post.
Nice segue into geopolitics then. So what do you think about Pakistan's role in the whole sad story of the 30-year war in Afghanistan and the Taliban?
I think it's hard to draw a line under it because it's still going on. I think it's... I guess I just, you feel for the country of Afghanistan and its people, because they've just,
Been fucked over.
Yes, I think we should have that on the record. Good statement. Shreela Ghosh, ex-director of the British Council. But, it's been it's just been a non-stop, battering for the Afghan people from all sides. And, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a whole series of, I don't know if you know them, Sigmar Polka photographs of Afghanistan when he's there as kind of part of the sort of hippie trail. It's but a lot of German hippies ended up in Afghanistan in the 70s.
Yeah.
And it's this sort of like, and what sort of encroachment is that? And it's this whole, I feel like, for me, encroachments became this, as you say, a wider geopolitical kind of way to navigate a whole series of problematic histories that are brushed under the carpet by various agents.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you talk about, somewhere I've read, you talk about the swinging Karachi, the 60s, swinging 60s in the Karachi. In documentary, I think, maybe 1 or 2 documentaries ago, where Afghanistan was a theme. I don't know if you saw those videos of people drinking and just having a great time in Kabul. There were amazing pictures of Kabul. And I think I read somewhere that at one time, a quarter of Afghanistan's income was tourism. It's quite hard to believe that now.
I mean, it equally applies to Kashmir, more than a quarter.
Oh, yeah.
If we think of a lot of these sort of zones that have become really hot zones, you just think what we're all missing out on. But of course, most importantly, those people who come from those regions.
Yeah.
I feel it quite keenly in Karachi because I just about remember there being nightclubs and bars in Karachi. I was a little kid, but I remember it being a very different feeling. It's sort of, I think in the 60s and 70s, Beirut and Karachi were the places to go to party. Even from Europe, Europeans would go to those places to party, and it's sort of because they knew how to party. And that's so kind of erased, even more so in Karachi, I think, than in Beirut, despite the civil war. Karachi is, its whole construct in the imaginary outside of Pakistan is, and even in Pakistan, it's been erased, to be honest. Researching this sort of beat band history, I remember sort of trying to get into EMI Pakistan's archives, and they were like, why do you, they didn't know what I was talking about for ages. It took me they're thanked in the credits, but it was a tough old process to kind of get them to even look for some of these tracks for me, and then they couldn't find some of them, and from this sort of moment, just to say that in the 60s, Swinging Karachi had this whole beat band scene where local bands that were mixed ethnicity, sort of Muslim, Christian, which totally is, now those communities are totally polarized. There's a really persecuted Christian minority, but they all hung out in the 60s and 70s. And I know this because, as well as kind of, a more academic research, I managed to trace various original band members from that period and actually interview them about their lived daily experience, not just the kind of the scene that they were part of, but actually their wider familial experiences, how much the communities were actually connecting and mixing and spending time in each other's houses. So this period, for me, is a kind of lost moment of possibility, because you had, it wasn't dialogue in any sort of, UN kind of way. People were just in each other's homes. So it was a lived experience. And also, a lot of these young musicians were just like, we would just really, they were getting bootleg tapes of kind of the Beach Boys and, early Phil Spector sort of productions, with the Four Tops and others, and just liking the sounds. And blending them with sort of classical Indian ragas that they knew. But also what's interesting to me, and some of them sort of laughed because they said, we weren't really thinking about that at the time, but I was like, but didn't it seem kind of really kind of bonkers to you that you were re-importing the sitar into Pakistan via California? And they were like, we didn't see it that way, we just really dug Phil Spector and Brian Wilson. And, and that's really sort of sweet as well, because it's just that sort of affect is sometimes more innocent than we want to make it.
Yeah.
But, and I'd heard some of these stories as a kid about the 60s and 70s in Karachi and how wild it was, but, just hearing from some of these guys, it's just, it was a real, it was really nice to sort of, in a human way, confirm the kind of more factual research.
Yeah. But I can't say I've seen any of that swinging 60s thing in Karachi when I was there, but I do have to talk about non-spaces, because you know hotels have bars, they're just not called bars. I think Mel might remember this bar. You know, all the hotels that are kind of open to Westerners, they have a room which is like just room 409, and when you check in, they sort of know from your passport whether you're Pakistani or whether you're British or American, or German or whatever, and then they say to you very quietly, if you want to have a drink, go to room 409. And the first time I was there, I thought, really? Should I? Yeah, and I did. And it was completely smoke-filled. There were like 20 people in there drinking whiskey and smoking. So it was the most unpleasant bar you could ever think of. But I was quite fascinated by the fact that if you just opened this door, it was Alice in Wonderland.
I think the way those spaces kind of open up, you know, it's that sort of magic space, isn't it? Yeah. And I didn't finish the story about all the ghosts. So the caretaker, after he takes me round the whole Neutra building, we're leaving, you know, after filming for the whole day and whatever, and I just think, I've got to ask him about the Sufi fakir. Yeah, otherwise I'll never forgive myself. And I was just like, you know all those stories, is there any truth in it? And he goes, come with me. And he took me, and because literally, as a kid, like there was the main entrance, which was for consular services, and there was a side entrance for us kids and families going to the American Center. And it was just by the path. I'd gone up and down, I don't know how many times as a kid. There was this little sort of boxed-in, walled-off room. He opened this door, it was sort of under a section of the architecture, and there was the shrine, perfectly preserved. And I was just like, holy mother of God, you know. And literally, because before going out, when I'd finally got permission to get to the site, you know, I'd been in regular contact with Neutra's son, with another lady, Barbara Lamprecht, who's like the main historian of Neutra's work, with R.F. Belgormi, who's a sort of leading architect in Karachi, who led the campaign to preserve the building. And nobody knew if there was any truth to this story or not. You know, it became in all our emails this like, are you going to ask about, you know, it was this, and it was there. And I remember just taking this photo on my phone and just sending it to them straight away, like, the shrine, you know, and it was suddenly like all the ghost stories were true. It kind of, you know, it was magic. It was really like, you know, because Neutra's son Dion, he'd said from what he remembered of his father telling him, but he couldn't even remember if this was just bedtime stories when he was a boy. His father had said he'd built around, that there was a shrine and he'd built around it. But even Dion didn't know if it was kind of, if it was stories. And it was just this, you know, even now I can feel, you know, I just feel that, you know, when you have those moments in life where everything falls into place and you're like, you know, just now I'm getting goosebumps recalling the physical, visceral feeling of him. He just said, come with me. And I was just, you know, like room 409. It's just like, follow me. And you're like, okay, you know, where are you leading me? Is this going to be, and, you know, obviously sort of working with VR and increasingly getting really into the sort of philosophical aspect of whether we exist at all or not. You know, I'm probably a little bit on the border of kind of being institutionalized. So when he said, come with me, and open the door, I was like, are we going to step through into this other portal dimension where, you know, maybe the Cold War went a different way, maybe Afghanistan, you know, is still a
happy place.
Still a happy place where, you know, you can buy high-grade opium cigarettes on the street and it's all wonderful.
No, those Afghan coats, you know, the ones I mean, the ones that look like a shaggy dog. You're wearing a shaggy dog. So I'm curious about decisions that you've made and why we're not seeing pictures of the shrine. It was obviously important to you.
The curse, Shreela.
Oh, okay. Sorry. You see, I just don't get superstition, so I don't even get that why you should not see it. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for explaining.
But I think also sometimes, you know, I remember a teacher of mine once saying, you know, you don't always talk about the magic because then the magic vanishes. You know, I think, you know, stories within stories, it's all somehow, you know, there, and It's in the space. I think even like what I tried to do downstairs with the wallpaper right up to the ceiling is this idea that where does the virtual space begin and end? Because I've always believed in the exhibition being a virtual construct. Well before I started working with virtual reality, you know, I think virtual reality is a very literal way of thinking through the virtual. I'm only really interested in it where it philosophically connects to the already existing space of the exhibition.
Yeah, so talk a bit about the bookshop, the virtual. I mean, I had a go at it. If you haven't, I would thoroughly recommend a trip along the shelves.
Yeah, somehow I wanted to kind of step back in time a bit further than just partition, because I thought, you know, with that idea that the present is so reliant on the past or so informed by the past in ways that actually we try to sort of push back against by brushing it under the carpet. You know, I thought this, you know, I can't just start with this sort of clean break in 47, because then I'm doing what Mountbatten attempted to do, and we know where that, you know, where that's still kind of playing out negatively. So I wanted to kind of start with Feroz Sons bookstore. So the first scene is Feroz Sons bookstore and publishing house in Lahore, which dates from the colonial period. It's an old sort of Raj era kind of architectural construction. And, you know, it felt of a piece with kind of trying to recover the Neutra building, because Feroz Sons closed in 2017. And it was a really special space to anyone from Pakistan and particularly from Lahore, because it was the longest running Urdu language bookstore and publishing house in the world. And there was something about the building that also, anybody who'd used it, it has a very strong presence in memory. For me, a lot of the story of this project and this exhibition, you know, even with the wallpaper, it's terrazzo. Terrazzo for me is on the floors, so I put it on the walls. But a lot of this is a story of what goes on beneath your feet. And, you know, what I really wanted to do was to kind of, I guess I was sad at the passing of this. You know, it really was a huge institution in terms of Urdu publishing, in terms of Urdu literature. You know, so there's a sort of sadness about whether that will now disappear, you know, as one more casualty in the way in which print publishing is sort of struggling and declining. But also there was something about, I wanted to kind of recover, archive, mirror that space that had meant a lot, not just to me, but to so many people. And one of the things about that space was the floor, because the people who owned Feroz Sons, you know, it had been there for hundreds of years, and whenever the floor was damaged, like there was a flood, at one point there was a fire not that long ago, and every time they just fixed whichever section of the floor needed it the most. And it was sort of, so this floor became this checkerboard of different tiled bits, concrete bits. It was just this sort of mishmash, but they added to the kind of, for me, to the warmth of the space. You know, it's like your grandmother's kind of kitchen, which is kind of not going to win any awards for design, but actually to your heart, it's the best design you could ever encapsulate, you know?
Well, it's kind of jugaad, isn't it? It's make, do, and mend. It's like, let's not bother retiling everything. Let's just patch it up here. That would do, yeah.
And there's a sort of beauty in that also connected for me to the way the encroachments go up. There's something about the ad hoc that's so human, you know what I mean? It's not attempting to kind of overwrite. It's filling in. There's something, you know, there's a sort of sensitivity in that I think, you know, we overlook in our sort of desire for sort of pristine perfection, the sort of monolith of good design and, you know, other such sort of vectors. And also there was just, shit, if this space just disappears, somebody had to mark it. And it became an interest, you know, I thought, well, this is something that VR could actually be useful for. I'm not an sort of uncritical kind of slave to VR. I think it's useful for certain projects because it can do things that maybe other media can't if you're trying to sort of activate something in a particular way. And so a lot of this project became about archiving space. And then if you go into the bookshop, I I've tried to be really faithful to the bookshop. I mean, please, if you haven't done the VR, or even if you have, go back and just do the floor. You know, I really took a lot of care and love with that floor. But also, the bookshop, the shelves would never have been like that. I basically very subjectively chose my favorite 120 book covers, Urdu book covers from the 1930s to the present day, because I like this idea of it being a double archive, not just of the space, but of its contents and a history of design. And in a way, because I was faithful to the building or to the shop, I thought I'd give myself a bit more free rein to kind of be entirely subjective with what were my favorite book covers over a long, extended period.
And then what happens when you go through the shelves and then you get into a tunnel, and then what happens?
Well, you go from the colonial era bookshop through a secret passageway in the back, you know, talking about room 409 again, and suddenly you're in this sort of slightly damp corridor that that takes you through to a 1980s video game arcade.
Mm-hmm. And did you spend a lot of time in a 1980s video game arcade?
I spent a lot of time and a lot of change stolen from my grandmother's wallet on video games, and my grandmother used to whack me on the back of the hand with a wooden spoon, and she taught me how to cook, and she was a mean teacher. She used to whack me whenever I got the quantity of a particular spice wrong. I go, shh, and I always thought that was unfair, but the video games, I deserved every whack I got with the wooden spoon, because I'd sneak into her handbag, because I was just, it was, comic books and video games were my crack cocaine as a kind of kid. I was very uncritical. I've had to learn a lot over the years, but as a kid, I mean, again, talking about flaws, in the 80s, there were all these pop-up video game arcades just were everywhere in Karachi. They were in kind of disused, crappy, rundown. I mean, that corridor was kind of pretty much like it was. They were in these crappy, disused spaces. They would pop up. There'd be, some sleazy guy smoking, and he'd just take all the kids' change and give you these tokens that you'd put into the machine, and it was this whole thing of high scores, and and I guess again you just didn't realize like the American Center till much later what was going on, and later I remember reading a lot of theory about 50s US sci-fi films being covert anti-Soviet propaganda, and then for me it was like, shit, all those video games like Space Invaders, Defender, they were all about territorial sovereignty. Shit. And why did they suddenly all appear in the 80s, during the Reagan years, just after the CIA-sponsored military coup in Pakistan that brought in the Islamists and got rid of the bars? Oh God, my God, it wasn't just the comic books and the Hostess Twinkies at the American Center that they had me on. They had me on the arcades too. I was fighting back the Soviet invaders, and stealing from my grandmother to do so. Shit, I'm the worst kind of stooge, So actually, all my work since then is a desire to expiate my sins.
Yes, I understand now. So, has your work been seen in Pakistan? Never? Often?
Somewhere in the middle. Mm-hmm. It gets shown from time to time, and it's always, and I have over the years gone back and taught when I've been there in some of the art schools there, and like artist friends of mine who are regular, who live there and are regular teachers there will often kind of get, if there's a particular student, they'll ask me if I can do a Skype tutorial with them or something. I mean, those are some of the sort of wonders you can have now with those, that sort of engagement.
Mm-hmm. But this project is going to be in the Lahore Biennial next month, no?
This month.
This month?
I actually fly to Pakistan tomorrow.
Well, we're very lucky to have got you.
Yeah.
So tell us, what are people going to experience?
Well, I kind of hate repeating exactly the same thing. So I really like it to be. I feel like if it's fresh for me, it's fresh for the audience, even if that sounds mad. But in a way, because this project was co-commissioned by NAE and Sharjah Biennial. So in a way, Sharjah was already last year, But in a way, this was always, for me, the kind of apotheosis of the project, because I could, being in a biennale where you're one of 70 artists, there's a sort of restriction on space and what you can do. So this was always the full project for me. And it was only in Sharjah that I got asked, could you bring this project to Lahore? And it's like, well, of course I'm going to bring it back home. But how do we do it in Lahore so it's meaningful? Sharjah was meaningful because it was the first outing. This is meaningful because it was like what I always wanted to do. It was, for me, the full scope of the project. It made sense in Nottingham because of the sort of different communities here. And we'd been thinking about a project for here for a while before I said, can we do this here? And the NAE team were really supportive of that and helped make this happen. And then it was like, well, what do we do in Lahore? And I was like, we've got to do it somewhere off-site and somewhere that sort of really resonates with the project. And for a while, we tried to get the now empty, defunct Feroz Sons, which wasn't possible because there's various family members. There was disputes over who owned the building and who had access. And one family member would say it's fine. Another family member wanted $10,000 a week. And, it was just, bonkers. And then basically on the same street, Mall Road in Lahore, as where Feroz Sons used to be, is a cafe called Pak Tea House, which has been there since partition and was and continues to be the literary salon of the city. So it's where all the writers go and smoke and argue and used to try and get their books published down the road. So it was kind of like, oh, this is the place where it all, the ideas just that would go, and they were open to it being there. And then I thought, if I've done the sort of full version of it here, there was no need to do it. I thought, I just wanted to do it really minimal back in Lahore. So it just sort of, it slipped in like room 409. I like it. People won't know what I'm talking about for the next year. Only people in this room will know what the hell I'm on about.
It sounds nice. So there's a chai shop downstairs, yeah?
Basically,
tea shop downstairs, yeah. and the installation is upstairs.
Yeah, Pak Tea House is over 2 floors. It's probably the length of this room, but not as wide. And the ground floor, I'm actually keeping functioning as Pak Tea House. So it's just, you could just go in and get your chai as you would normally. But then upstairs, which is the same footprint, there's basically, there's going to be the VR at the end, but the whole of upstairs has like a parallel dado rail, sort of really nasty 70s decor, going round the whole wall. And just between that gap, which is about this big, I'm going to wallpaper it. There's just going to be one strip of wallpaper. And then I've made 10 little paintings where I took the 120 favorite books and I chose my favorite 10 and made little paintings of each of the book covers to twice the size of the original books. So they'll just be there. And obviously, that's where some of those books were born. And that's it. It's just 10 little book covers and the VR at the back of the room, if you even go to the back of the room. And I like that idea that somebody might, if it's busy downstairs, somebody might go upstairs and then just go, this is weird, and leave again. I think that's beautiful, to give people that freedom and that option to not engage as well.
That's going to happen, yeah. I mean, I don't mean that rudely. It's just like, that's the point, isn't it, of not having it in a gallery, having it in that space. So I want you all to think of all the questions that you want to ask Shezad, and I've just got one last question. So that's what's happening next week for you in Lahore. I hope it goes really well. I wish I could be with you, but I'm not going to be in Lahore. So what else are you working on? What are your preoccupations? I mean, I'd be particularly interested to hear if you're going to continue your research into South Asian modernism and where that's going.
Yeah, so in a way, this is sort of project 3 of a sort of set of inquiries. So the first project I did was 2010, a decade ago, and I've been researching it longer, called Cities of the Future, which was about Corbusier and Chandigarh. It's probably the most famous and iconic of all the sort of modernists' architecture in South Asia. And obviously a lot's been done on it recently, but I remember being at college and I just sort of remember sort of trying to push back against tutors who would go on about Corbusier's and Western modernism's influence on India. And I said, what about India's influence on modernism? And, people go, obviously you've got to, times have changed, but when I was at college, it was a lot more sort of, there was this sort of assumed superiority that luckily is slowly being debunked, and kind of, we're sort of seeing the world as, hopefully, we're starting to move towards a kind of more rhizomatic notion of perception and the gaze. There's still work to be done, of course, and I hope to continue to do that. But I sort of thought with this show, rather than sort of fight an academic argument, I'd make a show taking a poetic leap and assuming that Tantra had a really big impact on Corbusier's designs for Chandigarh. And actually later sort of diary entries of his kind of corroborate how India, he felt, was his apotheosis and had transformed his vision. So interestingly, there was like a lot of writing that Corbusier had done that was being kept under wraps by Corbusier scholars because it didn't fit their narrative. The second project I did was about the Raymonds in Pondicherry. So Anton and Noemi Raymond, Czech-American architects, were very sensitive to non-Western architectural traditions. In fact, Raymond was fired by Frank Lloyd Wright from the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo for accusing Lloyd Wright of being an imperialist. And actually, after years of research, I found this letter basically telling Raymond he'd never work in this or any town again, written by Frank and signed by Frank Lloyd Wright. So the only project Raymond could get was at the Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry, working with the devotees on bamboo ladders with no budget to make what I think is one of the, to go back on the Correa one, I think his Golconda, it's called, it's one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. And then there's Neutra in Karachi, so that was a return to, it's the most personal one in a lot of ways. I did sort of launch part 4 in London in October, which, where I it was always my intention to move to a non-Western architect, so the project I did in London in October, which will also be in Dhaka in Bangladesh with a new variation in February, is about Muzarul Islam.
Oh, yeah.
The sort of Bangladeshi architect who was a student of Louis Kahn, but more importantly, he was an educator and an activist who did something much more interesting with the modern, because he took sort of early Vedic philosophy of non-dualism and took it into his role as an educator and activist. So he didn't see the modern as opposed to the vernacular or the rural to the urban. And it's this sort of freeing up of space that I guess that's why my projects take a while. I'm always building up to something that's emerging, because I think this sort of recovery of the past needs to move towards an emergent future. Otherwise, it's static. If we're not recovering these things and repurposing them or rethinking them or reinserting them into the conversation of where we might go next.
Yes, otherwise it's indulgent, isn't it?
Yeah, or just historicizing, or,
Yeah. So I'm just going to tell you one quick anecdote about Louis Kahn, which is not about Louis Kahn at all, but the parliament in Dhaka, Bangladesh's parliament, was designed by Louis Kahn and completed by Manzoor Islam. And I asked one of the bigwigs in Dhaka once why an American architect who was Jewish was commissioned for this building, and he said, "Oh yeah, no, we got it wrong because we thought he was Khan, as in Khan, So it's just a nice little anecdote from my cupboard. Right, who's got some questions for Shezad? Thank you, by the way. That was really enjoyed it.
May I ask one question?
Yes, of course. Just hang on a second.
There's a microphone coming your way.
Hi, this is Ismail. I would like to ask you first question. The year 1971, it is important for you for the relationship between Pakistan, Bangladesh, and USA? And the second question is, what is the current relation between Pakistan and USA? I know the current government, Imran Khan, is quite unique and very famous, and he's trying to do as best he can. So I would like to know from you. Thank you.
God, I think 71 and the spectre of it still makes me sad. I think there's, it represented a sort of, almost a series of failures. that I think we're all still traumatized by and trying to recover from. You know, a lot of the work I'm doing across the sort of three countries is, I hope at least on a human level, creating conversations and dialogues, you know, and friendships that can start to kind of, you know, reopen some of those spaces. Moving on to the present, I think
I should just say that 71 was the war between West Pakistan and East Pakistan and the birth of Bangladesh. So that's the moment that's being discussed.
Yeah, and I think it's still not properly articulated, you know, in any of the three countries. Everyone still kind of is still really stuck to their narrative about it. And, you know, I think, you know, truth is such a sort of fluid concept, but I think, you know, there's some work to be done in terms of healing around that. Yeah, it's, you know, I think it's still a lived trauma, isn't it? You know, even though I wasn't born yet, I you know, through friends, through family members, I grew up with it. And then I think the sort of present, I mean, interestingly, I like the Neutra building is kind of an emblem for me for US-Pakistan relations because it never became an embassy. Halfway through the construction process, the Pakistanis created the new capital of Islamabad, so the intended embassy only ever became a consulate. And in fact, you know, its high point, because of that, its importance was already reduced by the time it opened, and it recovered its importance when they installed the supercomputer. But obviously that was unacknowledged or disavowed. That whole section of the building was disavowed. So it's this interesting thing where, you know, in terms of power and the spectra of power, how that functions. And I think, you know, this US-Pakistan thing, I think, you know, like what happened with Mossadegh in Iran, the kind of the coup, the CIA-backed coup to institute Zia ul-Haq into power in Pakistan is still, you know, paying negative dividends for all concerned, for the country, for the US. You know, it's this sort of idea that that there's no cost to anything. There's always a cost, and I think maybe it's interesting that your two questions linked 71 and US interventionism, because, you know, both of those, you know, in a way I can't answer that because they're still lived histories that they haven't finished running their course, have they? You know, one only hopes that in the way even the process of individual trauma can be sort of mitigated through therapy, dialogue, that might move, that we might move to a more enlightened way to kind of approach these subjects. Pleasure.
Anybody else? I think we've got
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Hi, I've been in the VR space and really enjoyed it, and have a similarity of response with video game arcades in sort of little hidden spaces from a similar period to you. I'm involved in sort of documenting sort of and archiving spaces in VR, and I was just wondering what your approach to the visual aesthetics were in terms of getting a sense of immersivity.
I think, you know, it's not the only VR project I've done, and I'm constantly kind of trying to rethink approaches, and also, I guess, you know, for me, it's never separate from the consideration of the audience as well. So it's like, how do you both archive a space, but also add a certain visual hook or a sort of poetics that, because, you know, just if you're just faithful to a space, it starts to become slightly ghostly. You know, I think, you know, for me, if the opening scene of the bookshop didn't have the sort of ghost of the father and daughter or the secret passageway at the end, it would just be a simulacrum. You know, it's just those. How do you introduce those touches that actually provide enough of a narrative hook to keep people engaged, but without explicating either. So you allow that sort of ambiguity where people can explore with where you're not telling them. And it's that balance is one I'm always sort of struggling with and kind of trying, between projects trying to rethink and adapt. I mean, it's almost why I made the decision with, when you get to the outskirts of the Neutra building, it's warping all over the place. And that was like, for me, trying to sort of pack in all these, the ideas of, the secret floor, the function of the building, it's downgrading to a consulate. It's not static. So I wanted to kind of somehow, how it started to kind of dislodge itself in my brain from the actual building and into all these other vectors of thought. That's why it's sort of warping all over the place. And then when it resolves, you're in front of the American Center, literally in a, where I would have stood as a kid. And then, God, I hope I'm not spoiling it for people who haven't done it, but, and then the idea to project on the outside of the building, the interiors, was a nice way to kind of, I didn't want the literalness of going into the building and, I've just done the bit, I've done the outside, now I'll do the inside. It was sort of how do you, what's the magic that made that building magic for me and continues to kind of live large in my imagination? So I was thinking about, lots of things like Perek's species of spaces and, other ways to consider how space is not just, it's not just, four walls and a roof structure. It's all the sort of lived cognitive, disruptions that space makes.
And what period of time did the project take to make the VR?
Well, the VR, I work with coders and developers, and they're not cheap. So you do research for years, and then you have to make the thing, So in that way, I sort of try and make it in a few months. But that's also with getting coders, developers, and then working on it myself for a longer period, get them back in for a few days for things that I'm struggling with, and so it's sort of trying to kind of make sort of artist time, which is very slow and ponderous, kind of mesh with kind of developer time, which is very much like day rate and
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming, everybody. Thank you for your questions, and most of all, thank you, Shezad, for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Shreela. Thank you, everyone.